So welcome to today's episode, which is a Booktube discussion video on do you ever feel influenced by the personal lives of authors or their political views or their values, which sort of falls into two halves. One is sort of authors who are dead and happily for me can't sue me for anything I say in this video. And the second is contemporary writers who, of course, may say things on social media that you might find offensive or disagree, or there's so much scrutiny on anyone in the public eye now because anyone with a camera phone can catch someone in a bar behaving badly. So does that ever have any effect on your choice of books or what you think of a book, even in retrospect, having read the book and then later you find out something about the author? Might that change your view of the book? So those are the sorts of questions I'm going to deal with today. So one of the most sort of infamous examples is William Burroughs, who in a drunken incident in Mexico shot his common law wife Joan Valmere. Now I'm a huge fan of Burroughs, and I have to say that even though it's deeply troubling, the story of him shooting Joan, that hasn't affected my opinion of his books. So very briefly, the story is they were in Mexico because Burroughs had already had to flee America because of some drug offences. So already one knows that Burroughs is not a great human being in terms of following the law. And they're drunk in Mexico City, and Joan places a glass on her head, and Burroughs picks up his gun and says, "It's time for our William Tell act." There are others present in the room drinking. And Burroughs takes aim, and instead of hitting the glass, he shoots her straight between the eyes, and she dies. And part of the issue was that we don't quite know if that's really true, because Burroughs' story to the authorities in Mexico kept changing from day to day, and partly under the influence of his Mexican lawyer, who was himself a fairly reprehensible character, because he killed someone on his property which he claimed he was defending from trespass, and he went on the run to America. Anyway, what happened was that sort of Burroughs had sort of fed plenty of money into the legal system. Maybe they were bribes, and in the end he sort of hightailed it out of Mexico and was tried in absentia, and was suspended, had a suspended sentence for 2 years. So it's arguable that he never really faced justice for this murder. Burroughs himself in 1953, in his novel Queer, said that the killing of Joan has sort of forced him to look at the dark side of himself, and that has been the drive for his writing ever since. I've read lots of biographies of Burroughs because he is such an important writer to me and such an interesting figure. I'm not convinced by that personally. I mean, I have no definitive proof. There are possible shades of domestic violence. I mean, why was Burroughs sort of in a common law marriage when he was 100% homosexual? So there's lots of sort of questions that abound around this terrible incident. But for me, it doesn't affect my opinion of Burroughs' books. I'm not a reader who feels I have to know about the writer's background to sort of feed into the book. So that's sort of, not that I'm an academic English major, but the whole sort of structuralist literary criticism, as I understand it, is almost to take the author out of the book and sort of explain it by its sort of history and context of its times. Whereas the opposite is, this writer thinks, said and did that in his private life. Hemingway liked to hunt, shoot and fish, and that sort of influenced his writing. I'm not particularly interested in that. I don't seek that out in order to give me extra layers of understanding. So as terrible as the act of Burroughs shooting his wife was, it doesn't feed into my interpretation of his novels when I read them. So that's the first case. The second one is French author André Malraux, who on the face of it fought for the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War. Not only fought for them, but he used his influence to buy 9 military aircraft and recruit some pilots for it, because the Republicans had no aircraft, whereas of course Franco's fascists had access to Italian and German air forces, which Hitler and Mussolini had sort of lent him. So what could be more noble than that of Malraux? And yet, on the other hand, in 1923, he visited Cambodia, which was but then a sort of French protectorate, and sort of hacked off some of the bas-reliefs from the Angkor Wat temple. Um, art theft. It's what ISIS were doing. If they weren't blowing up ancient monuments, they were hacking the friezes off and selling them to raise funds. Well, I'm not accusing Malraux of raising funds, but he did the same thing. So that he wrote this book. He actually wrote three what are called Asian novels, but the one that was set in Cambodia was called The Royal Way, and I've read it, and it's fantastic. It's a great book, but in the back of my mind is, it came out of an expedition when Malraux went to find the Angkor Wat, and he was stealing treasures from it. And the problem for Angkor Wat today is so many people help themselves. It's so big you can't police it. It's an absolute massive edifice, and so many people have helped themselves to the bas-reliefs that this it's now got to the point where, as big as it is, it's just missing so many. And it's not the same sort of impressive structure that it was. So there's two sides of Malraux. There's the Republican active supporter, and then there's the art and antiquities thief, which you're going to go for. So that's Malraux. Ezra Pound was a Nazi sympathiser and a huge anti-Semite, as was Celine. And Celine wrote anti-Semitic tracts, and so much so that some of the Nazis actually sort of said, this guy's too much, he's too shrill. Now, I've never read Ezra Pound, but that's not because he was a Nazi sympathiser, it's because he wrote poetry, and I don't read a lot of poetry, and I certainly don't read difficult poetry that Pound wrote. I've never read Celine, but I wouldn't rule out reading Celine, because he's, from what I've sort of heard around the margins, he wrote really interesting, sort of fragmented, hyper-real narratives that actually might fit in with where I come from as a writer. So it's sort of more happenstance that I haven't read Celine. It's not a sort of moral stance that I've taken. So if you've got Celine on one side, who was sort of pro-Nazi, anti-Semitic, and you've got Samuel Beckett on the other side, who was sort of, definitely worked for the French Resistance in Paris. And I love Beckett. I mean, Beckett's one of my all-time favourite writers, both his plays and his novels. But so they're on the sort of seemingly the different side of the divide during the Second World War, and yet Beckett cites Celine favourably. When Beckett turned from writing in English to writing in French, there's a lot of sort of homage to Celine's French style of writing. So even though they were sort of fundamentally ideologically opposed, there's a sort of a symbiotic link between the two of them. So again, how do you reconcile that? As I say, Celine, one day I may get round to reading. I'm not going to be put off by. He was a terrible, terrible man. I mean, really one of the worst. And then another author, Genet, who was a male prostitute, a thief, a sort of general sort of nomad within France. Who's had a very bad upbringing in an orphanage and things like that. His mother was a prostitute. So Genet was had a tough start in life and sort of lived his life accordingly. But he wrote a book. His first book was called The Thief's Journal, obviously based on his experiences sort of living like that. And he was championed by all sorts of people like Sartre and who else? Malraux as well. And they said, no, this guy, whatever he's like as a person, he's a really important writer. And so he did sort of rise in the ranks of French literature. And I've read about 2/3 of his novels and all his plays, and they're fantastic. Now, The Thief's Journal is very much sort of directly out of his experience, but the plays are much more sort of universal themes of sort of authority versus the rest of us. So plays like The Maids and The Balcony and The Blacks are just fantastic stuff, and obviously, there's stuff that he has sort of come to think about through his life, but they're not based as directly on his sort of very, very specific lifestyle of being a sort of living on the margins. But interestingly, so he has this sort of one sort of lifestyle, for want of a better word, as a sort of a young man, on the lam, in and out of jail, petty thievery, he was homosexual, and he was often banged up for sort of gross indecent acts and things like that. But then towards the end of his life, he got very much into politics, and he was a supporter of the Palestinians. He was a supporter of the Black Panthers. He opposed the French sort of influence in Algeria, which was sort of breaking away from being a colony into independence. And he also, in one or two writings, wrote about a certain admiration for the Nazis. Now, his anti-Semitism, well, not as overt as Celine's, seems more drawn from his support for the Palestinian people and their cause. That's not to excuse it. That's just sort of to try and contextualise it. But his other thing is all of these things are charged with eroticism. His homosexual eroticism for Genet. So it's, the Nazi SS, particularly in their uniforms. The freedom fighters of the PLO and of the Fedayeen in Algeria. How the Black Panthers looked, with their berets and sort of dark leather jackets and stuff. This was the level he's sort of reacting to. It sort of fed his sort of erotic charge. So kind of a bit off kilter, really. It wasn't sort of the pure politics of it. He sort of expressed sympathy for the Bard and Meinhof gang. Again, this sort of outsider, terrorist, sort of romantic fantasy ideal that he had. So, Gide, far from perfect, but, I've devoured, his work gladly. There's an American author who, this is non-fiction, called Jack Henry Abbott, who was a prisoner, lifer, in the American system, and he wrote a fantastic book called In the Belly of the Beast, all about the experiences and the sensations of being in the American prison system in the 60s, particularly in solitary confinement, which is very sort of sensory deprivation. So you're in the dark, obviously you're solitary, so you don't hear or see anybody else. All you have is a hole in the floor for your waist, and it's a stunning piece of writing. I mean, it is non-fiction, but it could be, it's absolutely literary in that sense. And Norman Mailer championed for him, this is important work, he shouldn't be in prison, he should be out and stuff. And eventually they got him released, and he went and killed somebody else in a drunken bar fight. So, obviously a stripe of badness ran through him, and he was sent back to jail. But again, do I judge him ill for that? His book came entirely out of his experiences of being a criminal and a murderer. And it makes a worthwhile contribution, not only to sort of, the state of prison life, but to the sort of metaphysics of humanity and when you're in that situation of sensory deprivation. So again, bad man, yes, definitely. Does it put me off reading him? No, it doesn't. So those are the sort of the dead authors. And I have to say, I've read all bar Celine and Pound, and I'm not put off reading them either. So their personal indiscretions and worse do not detract. I don't feed them in. Possibly if I read Celine, I might, you can't help but do that. I don't know, that's possible. Well, I'm going to talk about two contemporary writers just to finish this up. And the first is Jonathan Safran Foer. So I really liked Everything is Illuminated and Up Close and Extremely Loud. Yeah, that was him. His first two novels. And then he sort of wrote sort of non-fiction and other stuff which I didn't read. And one of those was basically a book on sort of pro-vegetarianism. And that got turned into a movie, and Natalie Porter was the actress in it, or narrating it. I haven't seen the movie either. And they began a sort of a close, intimate, I don't mean sexually intimate, but sort of, mind meld relationship, which they carried on by email. Both are married, etc., with families. And these got increasingly intense. How do we know this? Because they were released into the public domain. Because what Safran Foer did was he left his wife, declared his undying love for Portman without checking with her whether she was prepared to leave her husband, which she wasn't. So all of this was out in the public domain. It was played out in literary circles. Everyone thought he was an absolute idiot. While people have affairs and leave marriages all the time, they normally have a pretty good idea of the possibility of success, and he didn't. He was so either blinded or arrogant. He just assumed that Porter would fall into his arms. And then their email correspondence was released. So the book that followed, the novel that followed after that, was called Here I Am, and it's terrible. It's not directly about that, but it's absolutely informed by that. It's so self-pitying. It's about a marriage that is sort of going nowhere, and the kids and all this sort of stuff. So there's an example where, now I read that book and disliked it. And then reading around it, I learned all this stuff about his private life because I didn't know about any of it. So I suppose it didn't change my view of the book. It just sort of underlined it, really. It sort of put it in context of, why I was reacting so badly to it, I think. So although he hasn't committed a dreadful sin, he did commit an act of absolute foolishness. And it didn't affect my reading of the book, but it affected my opinion of the book a bit. And it pushed it further to the extreme after I'd finished reading it. So that was that. And then the other writer I'm going to talk about is Jonathan Franzen, whose debut book, The Corrections, just blew away the literary world when it came out. And made him, really. And my problem with this is that I saw a lot of stuff, because I'm a writer, I'm reading about other writers and stuff, which I wouldn't normally, I wouldn't read about the lives of Sartre and Camus and in quite the same way, because I'm not looking for insights or whatever. But because Franzen is a contemporary, I noticed this stuff because it was increasingly getting play within the writers' community. Because what Franzen was saying was, there are so few great writers today, implying that he's one, and basically pulling up the ladder after him. He's made it. No one else is going to follow him because no one else deserves to follow him. And I was so disgusted by that attitude that I've refused to read Franzen. I've never read any of his books, and I never will. So there's one example where I have been influenced by the values and views of a writer, but not in a sort of universal sense of a Celine's anti-Semitism or a Burroughs murdering his common law wife. This is a very particular thing to the career that he and I practice. And that's, I don't think that's the same. That's a much sort of more focused, personal thing to me. Anti-Semitism, racism, domestic violence, these are all things I feel very passionately about. But I think, you have to engage them. You have to, you form your own views about them, and they're going to be hostile to all of those things. But actually, it's quite important having some source material and knowing on the other side of the argument where these things come from, where racism comes from, where domestic violence comes from. And if you close yourself off and just live in the bubble of your own views and believe you're right, your arguments are unlikely to be sufficiently developed because you haven't seen where these things emerge from. And on a sort of a broader thing, generally, there's far more. Well, a lot of art is apolitical. It doesn't take a position, but there's plenty of art which is political, and it tends to be on the left. There's much, much more writers informed by sort of liberal values or, further sort of socialist, Marxist, visions of how society is than there are on the right. I mean, they do exist on the right, but far less compared with sort of the liberal left tendency. And I think part of the reason for that is because the left side basically provides a critique of a contemporary society, whereas the sort of conservative right, not the sort of far extreme right, is basically accepting the fundamental society of capitalism and things like that. And art tends to be critical and curious, whereas if you kind of like the status quo or most of the elements of it, it's far harder to write a book celebrating that or enshrining that. It's, you may feel this is a generalisation, but for something like Brexit in the UK, where is any of the art emerging to celebrate the conservative, nationalist, patriotic triumph that is pulling the UK, that has led to the UK pulling itself out of Europe and a sort of internationalist protectionism. There isn't any that I can see. You know, it's been trumpeted in social circles, in political circles, but not in artistic circles. Even, you know, there must be plenty of artists who support Brexit, even though, you know, of course, artists make a living by sort of travelling around the world and, you know, having gigs and tours and performances in other countries. But there's no art being produced about Brexit, celebrating it. There's lots of art being produced about, you know, criticising it, and you know, gets wrapped around the sort of whole migrant issue and of sort of Syrian and what's happening in the waters of the Mediterranean of people dying. There's plenty of stories and art about that, but nothing from the other side. So it's not. I'm not really talking about sort of. I mean, I'm throwing that in. That's sort of not something that's hard and fast set, unlike the stuff about specific authors, which is something I have thought about a lot. So there you have it. So in the discussion box below and the comments, if you feel you want to sort of throw in your thoughts about this, you know, whether an artist's personal life, such as the details you know about it, would ever influence your choice of whether to read their books or not, or change your mind about a book of theirs that you know, since you found out about them. I mean, you know, this there's no right and wrong on this. There's no hard and fast on this. I'm just genuinely curious as to what people feel on this. Okay, so till next time. Thanks very much.